Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet struggle of soldiers in the frozen trenches of the First World War. Not the battles, not the gunfire, but the slow, unseen fight against cold itself. A fight that was just as dangerous and often more unbearable than the enemy across the line. The strange ways men tried to keep warm with rum, with makeshift fires, with scraps of imagination, even with odd rituals that only make sense when you've lived in mud and ice, tell us more about endurance than any medal or victory speech ever could. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see the little community that forms across the world, all of us settling in to listen to stories of the past. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's step quietly into those frozen trenches together, where warmth was never simple and survival itself was a strange kind of victory. The frozen front of the First World War is not remembered for its battles alone. It is remembered, quietly and in the margins of memory, for its endless cold. When we think of the trenches, it is easy to picture mud and barbed wire, but what is less often considered is the simple, unending chill that seeped into every inch of life. Imagine a place where the air never feels still, but always damp, heavy and raw, where even silence carries a kind of weight because the cold presses against skin and clothing without pause. The soldiers lived inside this cold, not just for a night, but for months at a time, and it became as much an enemy as any opposing army. The scene is easy to imagine if one slows down. A long, narrow trench, carved crudely from the earth, lined with sandbags that sag with moisture. The earth beneath is not firm but half frozen, half soft, so that boots sink and crunch at the same time. Water gathers in shallow pools, and ice forms a thin crust along the edges where men try not to step. Above the trench, the world is pale and grey. The sky seems drained of light, as though the sun has retreated, offering little warmth even at midday. There is no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, only the occasional crack of wood as something shifts under the frost. Time itself seems to move differently here, slower, stretched by the weight of damp air. In this atmosphere, soldiers found themselves constantly searching for warmth. Yet it was a warmth that refused to be found. Their breath lingered in front of their faces in little clouds, sometimes freezing in their moustaches, forming small icicles that clung to hair. Their hands grew stiff within gloves, or, for many, without gloves at all. A man could rub his hands together for hours and still feel as though the chill had seeped into his bones. Even those who were fortunate enough to be issued with thick wool coats soon realized that the damp made these garments heavy and useless. Wool that absorbed water became a kind of prison, trapping moisture against the skin, refusing to dry. The men carried their own cold around with them, woven into every fibre of their clothing. But what strikes one, when imagining this setting, is not only the discomfort, but the silence between discomforts. There were hours of waiting, long pauses when nothing happened. A man might stand at his post, his rifle cradled close, listening not to enemy fire but to the sound of water dripping from a trench wall. That slow, irregular dripping became its own companion, reminding him constantly that the earth was melting and freezing at once. In those moments, the cold seemed louder than any shell. It reminded them, quietly but persistently, that the trench was not simply a structure to shelter them from bullets. It was also a grave cut into the ground, damp and unforgiving. One of the stranger details remembered by soldiers was the way the mud and ice conspired together. The mud was never fully frozen, yet never fully liquid either. It clung to boots like glue, heavy and wet, but it also formed sharp ridges where ice cut across its surface. Boots, already stiff with cold, became clogged with this heavy earth, making each step a small struggle. Sometimes boots froze solid overnight. Men would wake to find that their boots, left outside their blankets, had turned into stiff, unyielding shapes. To put them on again required not only effort, but pain, because frozen leather does not bend, and feet must force their way into it. Some soldiers quietly admitted that they preferred to sleep with boots still on, uncomfortable as it was, rather than face the morning ritual of thawing them against their own skin. In the stillness of night, the cold deepened. Frost formed along the edges of sandbags, thin white crystals that glittered faintly in moonlight. Rats, ever present in the trenches, scurried along these edges, their bodies warmer than the air, their breath faintly visible in the chill. Oddly, some soldiers remarked that rats seemed to survive the cold better than men. They burrowed into straw, hid in packs, and found ways to stay warm, while the men, bound to duty and discipline, simply endured. More than one man confessed that watching a rat nest together for warmth stirred an odd kind of envy. There was something strangely comforting in that sight, even if it also meant chewed bread and missing rations. What is striking about these trenches is how little fire was present. Fire, after all, was dangerous. Smoke rose and betrayed positions. A large flame invited artillery, and so warmth from fire was rare, confined mostly to tiny stoves hidden deep in dugouts. Out in the open trench, men relied on body heat, on movement, and on imagination. One could march in place, swing arms, or stamp feet, but after hours of such effort, exhaustion always overcame motion. The cold returned, indifferent to every attempt. It was a reminder that the trench did not belong to the men. It belonged to the elements. They were only guests, and unwelcome ones at that. The sound of cold was peculiar too. It is easy to think of cold as silence, but in truth, it had its own sounds. Ice cracked when stepped upon. Wool rubbed stiffly against itself. Teeth chattered, a rhythmic clicking that seemed to echo in the stillness. Even rifles had their voices changed, for in the cold, the metal contracted, bolts stiffened, and loading became slower. Some soldiers swore they could hear the cold in the air, as if the very atmosphere hummed faintly with frost. Whether it was imagination or not hardly mattered. In the long dark hours, small sounds became vast landscapes of thought. What may surprise is that some men found unusual ways to measure the cold. They would hang a wet sock from a line and watch how long it took to freeze stiff. They would place a cup of tea on the ground and see the steam vanish instantly into the night. They told one another stories about cold winters back home, comparing them endlessly, as though the act of remembering other colds might lessen this one. Yet the trench always won. The cold of the trenches was not like the cold of home, where a fire could be built or a blanket pulled tight. It was a cold without escape, a cold that followed wherever one went, a cold that did not end when the sun rose. And yet, in this misery, there were moments that now seem almost surreal. Men sometimes joked about warmth in ways that bordered on absurd. A soldier might claim that if one stood perfectly still, the lice in his clothing would generate enough heat to keep him alive. Others joked that rats, though despised, could serve as companions of warmth if only one dared to let them nest close. Such remarks were not entirely serious, but in the stillness of a winter night, they held a curious weight. There is a strange intimacy in imagining men and vermin sharing the same struggle, bound together by the same unyielding cold. The front, then, was not merely frozen in temperature, it was frozen in time. Days bled into nights, and nights into days, without much change except for the deepening or lessening of frost. Soldiers kept watches, wrote letters, and tried to stay awake, all the while shivering against the walls of mud and ice. When dawn came, it brought no relief, only a duller version of the same grey light. In this endless cycle, warmth became more than just heat. It became an idea, a distant memory, something longed for in the same way one might long for home or for peace. Warmth became hope itself, fragile and flickering, like a candle in a place where candles could barely survive. To imagine the frozen front is not to imagine drama, but monotony. It is to imagine men standing in half darkness, wrapped in coats that do little, listening to water drip, watching their own breath fade, and waiting for something that rarely came. It is to imagine cold as a constant companion, one that never left, one that whispered quietly in the silence of the night, reminding every soldier that in the trenches, survival was not measured only by bullets and shells, but by whether one could endure the endless chill of the frozen front. When we think of the soldiers of the First World War, we might imagine them in strong, dependable uniforms. The images left behind, those old photographs in faded black and white, show young men standing in long coats and boots, sometimes with scarves tucked neatly into collars. At first glance, one might assume that their clothing was carefully designed for the long winters of Europe, tailored to protect them against the mud and frost. But the reality was something very different. Clothing, which should have been a soldier's first line of defense against the bitter cold, often turned into yet another silent enemy, as relentless and unforgiving as the war itself. The British soldier, for example, was issued a wool tunic and trousers. Wool was, in theory, a practical material. It was thick and it held warmth better than cotton. But in the trenches, where rain and snow fell into open earthworks, where mud seeped upward into every space, wool showed its darker side. Wool absorbed moisture and held onto it stubbornly. A wool tunic, once damp, could stay wet for days. It clung to the body like a heavy, cold shroud, and instead of protecting, it chilled. The soldier might spend long hours standing in freezing water, with a sodden uniform pressing against his chest and legs, each thread soaked and heavy, dragging his spirit down with it. On his legs, the soldier wore trousers of the same material, tucked into his puttees. Puttees were long strips of cloth, wrapped tightly around the lower legs, intended to keep dirt and mud from entering the boots. They were meant as a practical solution, a barrier between man and environment. But in winter, they worked like damp bandages. Once wet, they squeezed against the skin, trapping water, restricting circulation, and often contributing to the painful condition of trench foot. The soldier, wrapping these strips carefully each morning, must have known how little they would help by evening. And yet, the ritual continued, each day, as though repeating it might hold back the inevitable damp. The coat, often called the greatcoat, was a long, heavy garment that fell below the knees. It was warm enough on a dry day, perhaps on a march through the countryside before reaching the front. But in the trenches, where rain turned to sleet and snow blew across the parapets, the greatcoat became a burden. It was so heavy when wet that it restricted movement, pulling at the shoulders and dragging at the knees. Soldiers sometimes described it as wearing a blanket of stone. Some, in desperation, cut away parts of their coats or refused to wear them at all, choosing to face the cold with less weight rather than stagger under its sodden mass. Others learned small tricks, such as lining the inside with newspaper to create an extra layer of insulation. The rustle of paper inside the coat became a strange sound in the dugouts at night, a reminder that survival depended as much on improvisation as on what was officially supplied. Boots tell their own story. Soldiers were given thick leather boots, with hobnailed soles. These boots were expected to withstand months of mud and frost, but leather, once soaked, quickly stiffened and cracked. In freezing weather, boots could turn as hard as stone, making them almost impossible to put on after being removed. Many soldiers chose never to take them off at all, sleeping with boots still laced tightly, even though it meant their feet remained damp and sore. To remove the boots was to risk waking, to find them frozen solid, unwearable. A strange practice emerged in some trenches. Soldiers placed their boots under their bodies as they slept, using their own weight and body heat to keep the leather from hardening. It must have been an uncomfortable arrangement, lying on lumpy footwear through the night, but it was better than waking to find them useless. Inside those boots, socks were the first and most essential line of defense. Yet socks too became a torment. Wool socks, once wet, became abrasive. Soldiers often wore several pairs at once, hoping for warmth, but this only meant more fabric to hold water. Officers advised men to change their socks frequently, to dry them against fires or candles, to keep them off the ground, but the reality of trench life made this almost impossible. Fires smoked, candles dripped, and socks rarely dried completely. Soldiers sometimes tied damp socks to their bodies, tucking them inside tunics so that their own body heat could coax them toward dryness. The damp wool pressed against the skin, giving off its own strange odour, the smell of wet lanolin mingling with sweat and mud. In letters home, some men described socks as precious gifts, more valued than food or even cigarettes. A fresh pair of dry socks could mean the difference between walking and limping, between numbness and a fleeting moment of comfort. Gloves and hats were another story of inadequacy. Woolen gloves, if issued at all, quickly wore through at the fingertips. Soldiers often cut the ends off deliberately to allow fingers to handle rifles or pens more easily, though it meant more exposure to the cold. Scarves, knitted by women at home, were common, but they were no match for freezing winds that swept across open ground. Helmets offered no warmth, and many soldiers wore woolen caps beneath them, pulled low over ears that burned with frost. The image of a soldier huddled in a trench, helmet tilted awkwardly over a knitted cap, tells a quiet truth. Clothing was patched together, improvised, layered, and never quite sufficient. The curious thing is that many soldiers turned to objects not designed for clothing at all. Newspapers, straw, scraps of sacking, and even letters from home were pressed into service as insulation. Soldiers stuffed paper into boots, wrapped straw around legs, or lined helmets with rags. Some joked that the letters from loved ones not only warmed the heart, but also warmed the body when folded inside a tunic. In this strange transformation, paper became armour against the cold. Its rustling layers a soft protest against the indifference of official supplies. Imagine the quiet sound in a dugout at night, the whisper of paper shifting as men turned in their sleep, a sound born not of reading, but of survival. One of the strangest improvisations involved animal skins. In some areas, soldiers acquired sheepskin coats, either officially issued in small numbers or privately purchased. These coats were warm, lined with thick wool, but they carried their own oddities. When wet, the smell of lanolin and damp animal hide filled the air, a pungent odour that clung to everything around it. Some men disliked them intensely, claiming the smell was unbearable in close quarters. Others treasured them as the only reliable barrier against the cold. In this way, even a coat became a matter of compromise, a balance between warmth and discomfort. Clothing, then, was not merely a matter of fabric and stitching. It was a daily negotiation between body and environment, between what was supplied and what could be improvised. Each garment carried both hope and disappointment. A sock might promise warmth, only to bring blisters. A coat might shield from wind, but weigh down the shoulders. Boots might protect from mud, but imprison feet in damp leather. The soldier wore these contradictions each day, and each night he carried them into restless sleep. What is most striking is how clothing, meant to provide comfort, instead reminded men of their vulnerability. Every time a soldier pulled on his stiff boots, every time he wrapped damp puttees around his legs, he must have felt the weight of inadequacy. The uniform became a symbol not of protection, but of endurance. It was not the garment that allowed him to survive the cold, but his own persistence in wearing it, in improvising with it, in refusing to give in to the endless discomfort. There were, of course, small comforts. A dry scarf sent from home, a pair of mittens knitted by a mother or sweetheart, a fresh pair of socks from a parcel. These small gifts, though fragile, carried warmth beyond their fibres. They reminded the soldier that someone, far away, thought of him in the cold, and perhaps that thought itself was warmer than the wool, brighter than the damp fire, more enduring than the coat that dragged at his shoulders. And so, in the frozen trenches of the First World War, clothing became both shield and adversary. It failed more often than it succeeded, and yet it was all that stood between men and the biting wind. In its failure, it revealed a deeper truth: that survival depended not on perfect uniforms or sturdy boots, but on human resilience, on the strange and stubborn ways men found to endure, even when every garment clung damply to their skin. This paradox of clothing designed to protect, but which so often betrayed, is what lingers when we imagine those long winters. Not the neat uniforms of photographs, but the heavy, wet coats, the stiff boots slept upon, the rustling of newspapers tucked into trousers. It is in these small, almost forgotten details that the reality of warmth and cold comes alive. In them, we see not only what the soldiers wore, but how they endured, wrapped not only in cloth, but in patience, in persistence, and in the quiet will to survive another day. When one pictures the trenches of the First World War, the first thought is often of mud. Not the kind of mud one might encounter in a field after rain, but a different substance altogether, deeper, thicker, and almost alive in its persistence. It clung to every surface, seeped into every space, and seemed to consume both the ground and those who walked upon it. And nowhere was its presence felt more intimately than in the relationship between a soldier, his socks, and his boots. These most ordinary of garments, humble in their simplicity, became the site of an endless battle. They were not simply clothing, but daily adversaries and fragile defences, caught between the soldier's skin and the relentlessness of the earth. The boots given to soldiers were, in theory, strong, thick leather, hobnailed soles, heavy enough to endure long marches, but in practice they were never equal to the trenches. Leather, when dry, could be durable and resilient, but in the winter, when rain turned soil into endless pools of water, leather became a sponge. It soaked, stiffened, and cracked. A soldier might find that by the second or third day in the line, his boots were no longer an item of clothing at all, but a container filled with icy water, sealing his feet in dampness. It was said, half in jest and half in weariness, that boots in the trenches never really dried. They only alternated between being wet and being slightly less wet. Soldiers knew that no matter how carefully they placed them near a fire, no matter how much grease or dubbin was rubbed into the leather, the next step into the trench would undo the effort entirely. Inside those boots, socks became both salvation and torment. Wool socks, thick when new, offered some measure of warmth, but wool's kindness was conditional. Once damp, it became abrasive, chafing the skin until blisters rose, and blisters, in the filthy conditions of the trenches, were not just discomfort, they could become infected, turning small sores into wounds that threatened to linger or worsen. Soldiers were instructed, almost ritualistically, to change their socks often, to dry them, to keep their feet clean. But the reality was less straightforward. In the cold, socks never dried fully. A damp pair of socks hung over a candle would warm slightly, releasing a faint smell of wet lanolin and smoke, but by the time they were pulled back on, they were still clammy. A soldier could exchange one pair of damp socks for another, but seldom for anything truly dry. The army recognized this struggle, and socks became one of the most frequently supplied items. Parcels from home often contained them, lovingly knitted by mothers, sisters, or sweethearts. Each stitch carried the thought of warmth and care, yet once the wool entered the trenches, it quickly surrendered to mud. Some soldiers wrote home, not for sweets or tobacco, but for more socks, as though this small item might stand against the cold and wet. And in a way, it did. A fresh pair of socks, even if only briefly dry, offered a rare comfort, a fleeting sense of renewal. For a moment, a soldier could feel as though the battle against the mud might be winnable. But there was another, darker side. The boots themselves, once soaked and stiffened, sometimes froze during the night. A soldier who removed them before sleep might wake to find them hardened like stone, impossible to force back onto swollen feet. This led to a strange and uncomfortable practice. Men often slept with their boots still laced on, accepting the discomfort rather than risk being unable to wear them again. Some even placed their boots beneath their bodies as they slept, using their own warmth and weight to prevent the leather from freezing stiff. Imagine the strangeness of it, a man lying in the cold, his back pressed uncomfortably against the hard shape of his boots, sacrificing his rest so that his morning could begin with at least the possibility of walking. It was not a trick one would read about in training manuals, but in the trenches, survival was made up of such improvisations. The mud, however, seemed to conspire against these efforts. It was not merely damp soil. It was often described as bottomless, swallowing boots to the ankle or deeper, sucking at every step with a sound like slow, heavy breathing. To walk was to drag against this resistance, each movement a reminder of weight and exhaustion. Soldiers told of losing boots entirely, pulled from their feet by the suction of the earth. In such cases, a man might spend hours barefoot in freezing water, his socks immediately sodden, his feet numbing with every moment. Others, determined not to lose their footwear, tied laces tightly, even binding boots to their ankles with string or cloth, as though the earth itself were a thief that needed to be outwitted. Trenchfoot became one of the most feared companions of this world. Caused by prolonged immersion in cold, wet conditions, it began with numbness and tingling, followed by swelling, discoloration, and pain. In severe cases, the skin cracked and rotted, and toes were lost. The strange irony was that movement, walking, stamping, keeping circulation flowing was the only real defense, yet movement was exhausting and often impossible. Soldiers stood on sentry duty for hours, their boots sinking deeper into icy mud, their socks filling with cold water, unable to walk enough to save their feet. The quiet dread of trenchfoot hung over every man who laced his boots each morning, knowing that his clothing could betray him more cruelly than the enemy's bullet. To counter this, men invented small rituals. Some rubbed their feet with whale oil, issued in small tins, a greasy salve meant to repel water. Others cut pieces of sacking or paper and stuffed them inside boots as extra padding. A curious practice emerged of smearing candle wax on socks, in the hope that the hardened wax would create a barrier. It seldom worked as intended, but desperation inspired creativity. There are even quiet accounts of soldiers wrapping feet in newspapers before pulling on socks, the print pressed against their skin, the ink sometimes staining their toes. One wonders if, in the stillness of the night, a man could read the blurred words against his feet by candlelight, a newspaper serving both as insulation and a fleeting connection to the outside world. Mud claimed not only comfort, but dignity. Boots caked with layers of it became heavy, misshapen, their original colour lost under coats of filth. Socks stiffened with dried mud became brittle, cracking as they were pulled on again. And yet, soldiers carried on. The ritual of cleaning boots and socks, of scraping mud with knives or sticks, became almost ceremonial. It was rarely successful, mud always returned, but the act itself was a form of resistance, a statement that a man might still care for his appearance, however futile. Perhaps, In the rhythm of scraping, brushing, and pulling on damp socks once more, there was a kind of solace, a reminder of ordinary life in a world that was anything but ordinary. At night, when men gathered in dugouts, the talk often turned to feet. It may seem odd, but in that environment, one's feet were a measure of survival. Soldiers compared whose were worst, whose socks were still intact, whose boots had begun to crack. Jokes were made, often grim, about feet no longer belonging to their owners, but to the mud itself. In this strange intimacy, socks and boots became shared topics of concern, as central to life as food or letters from home. The smallest detail, a pair of socks dried over a flickering candle, the faint warmth of boots kept beneath a blanket, carried disproportionate weight. To outsiders, these might seem trivial matters. To the soldier, they were the difference between enduring the night and succumbing to it. There is also something almost symbolic in the way mud, socks, and boots were bound together. The earth, in its relentless wetness, tested every layer between it and the soldier's skin. Socks absorbed, boots contained, feet suffered. It was a chain of misery that repeated day after day, and yet, within it, men discovered small triumphs. A dry sock carefully saved for the right moment, a boot kept supple with grease against all odds, a night when the mud froze just enough to harden, allowing boots to walk more easily, even if the cold bit more fiercely. These were victories too small to be recorded in official histories, but deeply meaningful to those who lived them. What remained strange, even after all these years, is how something as ordinary as socks and boots became such defining features of life and suffering in the First World War. They were not weapons, nor grand strategies, but they carried the weight of daily existence. They were fragile defences against the most basic of elements, water, cold, and mud. And in failing to defend, they revealed the deeper truth of war, that survival often came not from great battles, but from enduring the smallest, most persistent discomforts. When one imagines those long winters, one might think less of the sound of gunfire and more of the quiet rustle of damp socks pulled on in the morning, the heavy thud of boots sinking into mud, the faint hope carried in the parcel that brought a fresh pair from home. In such details, the soldier's world becomes clear. It was not just a battle against the enemy, but against the ground beneath his feet, the water that seeped into his boots, the socks that chafed and chilled. And in that battle, fought silently each day, endurance became its own kind of victory. In the frozen trenches of the First World War, warmth was always uncertain. The uniforms clung damply to the body, the boots filled with mud, the socks rubbed raw against cold skin. Yet even in that bleak landscape, men sought fire. Not the roaring blaze of a hearth or the steady glow of a stove, but tiny fragile flames, coaxed from damp matches or flickering candles, hidden in dugouts and corners of trenches. These small fires and faint lights became central to life, symbols of comfort as much as sources of heat, and in their smoke and glow we find another quiet story of endurance. The first and most common flame was the candle. Soldiers received them in rations or purchased them from canteens. At first, a candle might have seemed trivial, a small stick of wax with a thin wick, but in the trenches it became something far greater. A candle gave light in the darkness of dugouts, where daylight seldom reached. It offered the possibility of warmth, however slight, when men huddled close. A candle could dry a sock, if one had the patience to hold it near for hours, turning it carefully so as not to scorch the wool. It could heat a tin of bully beef, making the cold fat more bearable. And sometimes, in moments of quiet, a candle flame was simply something to look at, a reminder of stillness amid chaos. Its soft light, a fragile promise of normality. There were stories of soldiers using several candles together, placed beneath a small iron plate or even a mess tin to create a makeshift stove. The heat was modest, but enough to warm fingers or take the edge off freezing rations. In some dugouts, the glow of multiple candles lit the cramped space, casting shadows on the walls of mud and timber. Imagine the sight: rough walls damp with moisture, smoke curling upward to the roof, the faces of weary men lit by shifting light. It must have felt both comforting and eerie, as though the underground room had been transformed into some forgotten chapel, where the candles burned not for prayer but for survival. The smell of candles was distinctive too. Ordinary wax gave off a faint sweetness, but many candles in the trenches were made of tallow-rendered animal fat. These smoked and smelled unpleasant, filling dugouts with a greasy odour that clung to clothing. Yet even this was preferable to darkness. The men tolerated the smoke, breathing it in alongside the damp smell of earth, the scent of unwashed bodies, and the faint tang of gunpowder that drifted down from above. Over time, the smell of a burning candle must have become linked in memory with a fragile sense of security, as much a part of trench life as the mud itself. For more serious heat, soldiers turned to small fires. But here they faced another difficulty. Wood was scarce, and when it could be found, it was often soaked through. Soldiers collected scraps wherever they could: broken boards from ruined houses, shattered furniture, even splinters of the very timbers meant to hold up the trench walls. They burned straw, paper, and whatever else would catch. The fire smoked and hissed, spitting sparks as damp material resisted the flame. In dugouts, the smoke had nowhere to go, so it hung in the air, stinging eyes and coating walls with soot. Men coughed and wiped their faces, yet they continued to feed the flames, preferring smoke-filled lungs to cold fingers. The strange thing is how these small fires became almost ceremonial. Men gathered around them, not in silence, but in quiet companionship. A tin balanced on the flames might be passed from hand to hand, each man warming his fingers on its sides before taking a mouthful. The conversation was subdued, the crackle of fire filling the pauses. In that dim glow, men shared cigarettes, letters from home, and thoughts too small for daylight. The fire was not simply warmth, it was a gathering point, a place where the war momentarily faded and life took on a simpler rhythm. Sometimes, the desire for fire led to peculiar improvisations. Soldiers placed hot coals inside empty food tins, carrying them back to dugouts as makeshift heaters. Others experimented with burning odd materials, scraps of rubber, canvas, or even the wooden handles of tools. The smoke from these improvised fuels was foul, yet it gave off heat, and heat was precious. There are accounts of soldiers warming their hands over smouldering heaps of sandbags, cut open and stuffed with straw. The ingenuity was endless, born of necessity, and often carried a kind of strange, quiet humour, as though men found solace in turning the most unpromising object into a source of warmth. Perhaps the strangest warmth of all came from fires. Made of letters and books, soldiers sometimes burned their own correspondence, either to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands, or simply because paper burned more easily than damp wood. To imagine this, a letter from home, filled with words of love and comfort, sacrificed to keep fingers from freezing, is both sad and strangely poetic. In burning a letter, the soldier received its warmth in another form, not as memory or emotion, but as flame and smoke. For a few minutes, the words became heat, the handwriting transformed into glowing ash. Some soldiers joked about this, but beneath the humour, there must have been a quiet melancholy, a recognition of how survival demanded such choices. Larger fires, of course, carried risks. Smoke rising from trenches could reveal positions to the enemy. For this reason, fires were often small and hidden, their glow shielded from view. At night, soldiers were careful with light, knowing that even a candle flame could be spotted by a watchful sniper. The desire for warmth was always balanced with caution, and the flame itself became both comfort and danger. It is curious to think how something so small, a flicker of light, could be both lifeline and liability in the same moment. The smell of smoke was ever present, lingering in clothing, hair and skin. Mixed with the damp air of the trenches, it created a scent that must have been unforgettable. Soldiers described returning from the line with the odour of smoke clinging to them, as though the trench itself had marked them. In dugouts, where fires burned most persistently, the air grew thick with it. Some men found this comforting, associating the smell with warmth. Others disliked it, finding it oppressive, another reminder of confinement. Yet whether welcome or not, it became inseparable from life in the trenches, woven into every memory of winter nights. There were moments too when the fire itself became almost symbolic, a candle burning steadily through the pie. Night could be a source of quiet reassurance, something for tired eyes to rest upon. The flame's persistence mirrored the soldier's own endurance, fragile, flickering, yet unbroken. Some soldiers wrote of watching candlelight dance on dugout walls as they drifted to sleep, the shadows stretching and shifting like silent companions. In those moments, the flame was more than light. It was a reminder of something human, fragile and enduring amid the harshness of war. There is a curious story from the trenches of men roasting rats over small fires. It sounds almost grotesque, but it reveals the strange intertwining of necessity and survival. Rats were plentiful, and though most soldiers despised them, some saw them as a last resort for food. To roast such a creature over a candle or fire was both desperate and practical, an act that blurred the line between horror and endurance. It was not common, but it lingered in the stories told after, a strange reminder of how fire served not only for warmth, but for sustenance in the bleakest conditions. The role of fire extended beyond the physical, into memory and imagination. A candle's flame could call to mind the lamps of home, the warm glow of a kitchen hearth, the familiar smell of smoke from a household chimney. Men, huddled in damp dugouts, spoke of fireplaces and stoves, of hot meals eaten beside them, of evenings where smoke meant safety rather than suffocation. In this way, every flame in the trench carried not only heat but memory. It connected the present suffering to past comfort, bridging the gap between mud and home. What is striking, when one considers all this, is the fragility of these sources of warmth. A candle could gutter out with a breath of wind, a fire could be extinguished by a sudden downpour, smoke could choke as easily as it comforted, and yet soldiers clung to them, tended them carefully, and cherished them in their smallness. In their weakness lay their meaning. The candle, the smouldering wood, the faint glow in the darkness. These were reminders that even in the coldest nights, men could create light, however brief. To walk through a trench at night must have been to see pinpoints of glow here and there, small flames shielded by hands or dugout walls, their smoke rising into the damp air, the smell of wax and tallow, of burning straw and wood, mingled with the smell of mud and wet wool. And amid it all, the low murmur of voices, the faint laughter, the scrape of spoons against mess tins warmed over flames. This was the quiet life of the trench, a world built around fragile fire. In the end, fires and candles in the trenches were never about true warmth. They could not defeat the winter, nor banish the cold that crept into every joint and limb. But they offered something smaller, something gentler, moments of comfort, light in darkness, companionship in smoke. They were not grand or heroic, but they were essential. And in remembering them, we see the humanity of those who lived in the mud, who sought warmth in flickering flames, and who carried the memory of smoke and candlelight long after the war was done. The trenches of the First World War were not places of comfort. The air was damp, the mud clung to everything, and the cold seeped into the bones in ways that clothing, fires, and candles could not always keep away. Yet, there was one source of warmth that soldiers looked forward to with a mixture of relief and ritual: the rum ration. It was not a large measure, not even close to what might be called indulgence, but in its smallness it became significant. Each day, or sometimes each morning in particular, men lined up with mess tins or enamel mugs, waiting for a ladle of liquid that promised a different kind of heat. This warmth was not one that lingered in the dugout walls or radiated from glowing coals. It was a warmth that spread from within, a quiet, creeping fire of its own. The rum ration was given out with a certain ceremony. Typically, it arrived in large stone jars or ceramic containers, distributed by non-commissioned officers who measured it out carefully, ensuring that each man received the allotted amount. The quantity was modest, a single gill, or sometimes less, but in the context of trench life, it felt like abundance. Soldiers would cradle their tins in the cold morning air, steam rising faintly if the liquid was warmed with hot water, the smell sharp and unmistakable. The taste itself was harsh, burning the throat, but that harshness was welcomed. It was proof that something strong had entered the body, that the cold would be chased out, if only for a little while. Rum itself was a drink long associated with sailors and empire. It carried with it a history of distant seas, sugar plantations, and naval traditions where it was once part of daily life. For soldiers who drank it in the frozen mud of France and Belgium, this connection must have felt strange. Here they were, land-bound, their boots soaked through, and yet their small portion of rum tied them to centuries of men who had braved storms, winds, and waves. The rum ration became not only a comfort, but a link to something larger, a tradition that stretched beyond the war. To drink it was to participate in a ritual older than the trenches themselves, and in that sense, it gave the act a kind of weight and dignity. The psychological effect of the rum ration cannot be overstated. The liquid was strong, and its warmth spread quickly, giving faces a faint flush and easing stiff muscles. Men often spoke of it as if it were a medicine, not merely a drink. Officers themselves recognized this effect. They saw how rum lifted spirits, how it calmed nerves before an attack, how it gave men a sense of courage that could not always be summoned otherwise. It was never enough to make soldiers drunk, or at least not usually, unless they managed to barter for extra, but it was enough to soften the edge of reality. In that softened edge, men found the strength to carry on, step by step, day by day. There was also something curious in the timing of the ration. Often, it was given in the early hours, just before dawn. These were the coldest hours, the moments when frost gathered on the ground and the trench walls seemed to exhale chill with every breath. To receive rum at such a time was more than practical. It became symbolic. The soldiers would brace themselves for the day, for whatever tasks or dangers lay ahead. And rum was the quiet preparation. It was a kind of ritual awakening, a ceremony that told them, yes, you will go on, yes, you will endure. The faint burn of rum in the chest was the day's first sign of resilience, and perhaps even its first sign of hope. The strangeness of the rum ration lies not only in its effect, but in the stories that surrounded it. Some soldiers hoarded their share, saving it for moments of deepest need. A small tin of rum tucked away could become a private reserve, a comfort known only to the one who kept it. Others traded their portion for cigarettes, for food, or even for favours. In the strange economy of the trenches, rum had a value that went beyond its taste. It became currency, something to be bargained with in whispers and exchanged in secret. In this way, the ration lived multiple lives, as comfort, as ritual, and as coin. There were moments, too, when the rum ration took on an almost absurd quality. Imagine men huddled together in a trench, the mud rising to their ankles, rain falling steadily, and from somewhere down the line comes the call for rum. A non-commissioned officer appears, carrying a container sloshing with liquid. One by one, the soldiers hold out their mugs, watching carefully to make sure no man receives more than another. The measure is small, barely covering the bottom of the tin, but still the men cradle it as though it were gold. And in that moment, as the liquid burns their throats and warms their stomachs, the mud, the rain, and the cold recede slightly into the background. The war is not over, the danger has not gone, but for a few minutes, something like comfort has arrived. There were oddities, too, in how rum interacted with trench food. Some soldiers poured their ration into tea, creating a makeshift grog that warmed both body and spirit. Others mixed it with condensed milk or stirred it into bully beef to soften the cold fat. The combinations might sound unappetizing to us, but in the trenches, practicality outweighed refinement. Anything that could make the daily rations more bearable was welcomed, and rum became an ingredient as well as a drink. One can almost imagine the strange flavors, the sharp bite of alcohol mingling with sweetened milk, or the unexpected warmth seeping through a meal otherwise bland and cold. The presence of rum also raised questions of fairness. There were men who did not drink for reasons of personal choice or religion. Their portions were sometimes passed along, sometimes saved, and sometimes used for other purposes altogether. In a few cases, rum was applied not as drink, but as medicine rubbed on frostbitten toes, mixed into compresses for aching joints, or even dabbed onto gums to numb toothache. Such uses may have had little scientific foundation, but in the trenches, belief itself was part of the cure. To rub rum onto cold skin was to believe, if only briefly, that warmth could be drawn back into the body. There is also the curious fact that rum, while a comfort to soldiers, was a subject of debate among commanders and politicians. Some argued it kept men steady, others that it dulled their senses. There were questions about whether it was truly necessary or merely tradition. Yet despite these debates, the rum ration endured. It endured because soldiers wanted it, because officers saw its effect, and because in a war where so much was stripped away, small rituals of comfort were fiercely protected. The argument around rum reminds us of its double nature. At once a practical measure and a symbolic gesture, both medicine and morale. What is perhaps most remarkable is the way rum lived in memory. After the war, veterans spoke of it not as indulgence, but as something almost sacred. They recalled the taste, the burn, the faint warmth spreading in the chest. They remembered the silence of the morning line, the careful ladle, the ritual of distribution. Some described it as the one moment of the day they looked forward to without hesitation. In all the mud, cold, and fear, the rum ration stood out as something steady, dependable, almost kind. To drink rum was to remind oneself, however briefly, that life still contained small pleasures, and that endurance was not only possible but shared. There are curious stories of men dreaming about rum. In moments of fever or exhaustion, they imagined great barrels of it, overflowing, endless. One soldier wrote of a dream where he swam in a sea of rum, the warmth surrounding him like sunlight. These dreams may sound strange, even humorous, but they reveal how deeply the ration lodged itself in the imagination. It was not only physical comfort, it was a symbol of abundance in a world of scarcity. In dreams, the ration was transformed from a ladle full to an ocean, from a small measure to infinite supply. Even the containers of rum carried meaning. The stone jars in which it was transported were heavy, solid, and marked with the initials of the supply. Soldiers sometimes kept fragments of these jars, chipped pieces carried away as keepsakes. To hold such a piece was to hold a memory, a connection to countless mornings when rum was poured into tins. These fragments, dull and unremarkable to outsiders, became quiet treasures for those who knew their story. They are reminders of how ordinary objects in extraordinary times take on strange and enduring significance. If one thinks carefully, the strangest aspect of the rum ration is how something so small could mean so much. It did not last long, nor did it truly change the conditions of the trenches. It did not stop the cold, nor prevent frostbite, nor heal wounds. And yet it gave something that nothing else quite could, an inner fire, brief but real, that made the next step, the next hour, the next day possible. Its warmth was not measured in temperature, but in spirit, not in degrees, but in resolve. The rum ration did not save lives in the way that blankets or boots did, but it helped men continue living in conditions that might otherwise have been unbearable. At night, when soldiers lay in dugouts, the memory of that small burn in the chest might linger. It was a reminder that even in the deepest cold, something could kindle warmth inside. It was a memory carried from one day to the next, a promise that tomorrow too would bring its measure, its ritual, its small mercy. The rum ration became part of the rhythm of life, one of those quiet constants that gave shape to endless days. Without it, the war would have been colder, not only in body but in spirit. With it, the men found one more thread of endurance, one more fragile flame to carry them through the mud, the frost, and the long nights of waiting. The human mind, when placed under pressure, often invents peculiar solutions. In the frozen trenches of the First World War, soldiers learned to endure not only through issued supplies or official measures, but also through a collection of small, strange comforts they devised themselves. These comforts were rarely elegant and almost never clean, but they were born of necessity, and necessity has a way of teaching resourcefulness. To look closely at these odd rituals and makeshift methods is to see how men transformed the bleakest environment into something marginally more livable, something that carried a hint of warmth in a world of frost and mud. One of the most curious comforts was the use of heated bricks. Whenever soldiers were fortunate enough to come across bricks, sometimes scavenged from ruined villages, sometimes lifted from collapsed farmhouses, they discovered that placing them near a small fire until they glowed faintly with heat turned them into temporary radiators. Once heated, the bricks could be wrapped in cloth or tucked into socks and carried back to the dugout. For a brief while, perhaps an hour or so, the brick would release its heat into the surrounding air or warm a soldier's feet as he tried to sleep. The practice was strangely domestic, recalling hearths and kitchens, yet carried out against the backdrop of shellfire and silence. There are quiet accounts of men speaking fondly of a heated brick, as though it were a kind of fragile luxury. But the strange thing was that soldiers also believed, perhaps half seriously, that if a brick cracked while cooling, it carried bad luck for the night. Superstitions grew around these makeshift comforts, as though warmth itself carried omens. Another improvisation was the creation of hot water bottles, though of course there were no glass or rubber bottles to be found in the trenches. Instead, men used what they had at hand. Empty metal shell casings, once cleaned and filled with hot water, became oddly effective substitutes. They were sealed with cloth and hugged close against the chest or slid into sleeping sacks. Imagine the strangeness of finding warmth, not in an object designed for comfort, but in one that had once been a vessel of destruction, a casing that carried death transformed into a source of warmth. There is something unsettling yet deeply human in that inversion. Soldiers themselves often noted the irony, half amused, half resigned. In a war where so much was turned upside down, even the tools of battle were repurposed to serve the body's simplest needs. Newspapers also found their way into strange roles. Soldiers discovered that folding newspapers and stuffing them inside jackets or trousers provided an extra layer of insulation. The thin pages trapped air and kept warmth close to the skin. At first glance, This might seem comical, pages of newsprint rustling beneath a tunic, but for many men, it worked better than official clothing. There are scattered mentions of men lining boots with paper or wrapping socks in sheets torn from old issues of the Times or the Daily Mail. Sometimes the words smudged against damp skin, leaving ghostly headlines printed faintly onto legs or feet. It must have been a curious sight. To remove one's boots and find yesterday's war reports imprinted like a second skin. This strange mingling of words and flesh created an odd intimacy between the soldier and the printed page, as though the news itself had wrapped around his body to keep him alive. Some comforts were less practical and more symbolic. A common practice was carrying small tokens, lockets, photographs, a handkerchief from home that soldiers pressed against their skin in the cold. These did not generate warmth in any physical sense, but they carried a remembered heat, the warmth of memory itself. A photograph of a mother, a sweetheart, or a child could conjure the sense of sitting beside a fire at home, the crackle of logs, the smell of cooking. The imagination filled in what the body lacked, and in those moments, the cold retreated just a little. There are letters from soldiers who admitted they fell asleep more easily when holding such tokens, as if the body could be tricked by memory into feeling warmer than it was. Rats, too, became part of these strange comforts. The trenches were full of them, swarming through dugouts, scurrying over sleeping men, gnawing on rations. And yet, in some strange and unspoken way, rats also provided heat, their bodies warm and quick, often pressed close in the night. Some soldiers admitted, though not always proudly, that the warmth of animals made the darkness a little more bearable. One can imagine a soldier lying still, wrapped in a blanket, feeling the weight of rats against him, disturbed but unwilling to push them away because their heat was real. It is an odd thought. Companionship in the form of vermin, warmth in what would normally be disgust, but in the strangeness of trench life, even rats took on unexpected roles, both loathed and, in some hidden sense, relied upon. Another peculiar method was the practice of sleeping close together, shoulder to shoulder, bodies pressed tight in a way that men might have avoided under ordinary circumstances. In civilian life, such proximity would have seemed invasive, but in the trenches, it was survival. Soldiers arranged themselves like spoons in a drawer, conserving each other's heat. There are quiet references to men remarking on the smell of sweat, tobacco, or damp wool mingling in these arrangements, but also on the strange comfort of it. The human body became, for a moment, its own stove, and the trench, a long, breathing bed of warmth. Some even spoke of the rhythm of breathing, creating a lullaby of sorts, a slow rise and fall that soothed men into uneasy sleep. Candles, too, were used in ways that seem strange to us now. Beyond providing light, they were sometimes balanced under tin mugs to warm water or food. But there are also accounts of soldiers holding candles beneath their boots, trying to soften stiff leather or dry damp socks. The smell of burning wool filled the air, sharp and acrid, and sometimes the flames singed too far, leaving holes in fabric. Yet men persisted, willing to risk the damage for the chance at warmth. Candles were also placed close to the skin, their heat radiating faintly through tin or enamel surfaces. It is difficult to imagine such small flames doing much, and yet for men who had little else, every degree of warmth counted. There was even a peculiar belief among some that if you stared at the candle's flame long enough, you would feel warmer, as though the mind itself could be convinced into comfort. Cigarettes became another curious form of warmth. Not in the physical heat of smoke, though there was that too, but in the ritual of lighting and inhaling. The small fire at the tip of a cigarette glowed in the dark, its heat pressed against lips and fingers. Soldiers wrote that the first drag in the morning, when frost still clung to the trench walls, felt like a kind of awakening. Smoke filled the lungs, hot and sharp, and spread a sensation that the cold could not quite match. There were even men who saved cigarettes solely for the coldest nights, treating them not as a habit, but as a remedy. The strangeness lies not only in the act, but in the way tobacco became associated with heat, a symbolic fireplace in the palm of one's hand. One of the more unusual comforts was singing. Soldiers gathered in dugouts, shivering beneath blankets, and sang songs softly into the dark. Singing did not generate heat in the body, except perhaps in the lungs, but it generated warmth of another kind. Voices blending together created a shared sense of life, a reminder of humanity in a setting that often seemed designed to strip it away. Songs from home, hymns remembered from childhood, or even bawdy tunes carried from pubs, each one carried with it a memory of warmer places. In a strange way, the act of singing together created a blanket of sound, something that wrapped around men as surely as any coat. And in that sound, they found comfort. There are also scattered reports of men using straw or hay, whenever they could find it, to line dugouts or pack around their bodies. The straw was often damp, riddled with lice, and hardly clean, but it trapped warmth all the same. Soldiers sometimes referred to it jokingly as the trench mattress, though it scratched the skin and left men itching for days. Yet they returned to it again and again, grateful for the insulation it provided. The strangeness here lies in the dual nature of straw, both comfort and discomfort at once, a reminder that the warmth in the trenches was never clean, never without cost. Perhaps the oddest comfort of all was imagination. Men spoke of conjuring warmth in their minds, of picturing themselves by firesides or remembering the weight of heavy blankets at home. Some described closing their eyes and recalling in exact detail the layout of a familiar room, the armchair by the fire, the kettle on the hob, the curtains drawn against the winter night. The mind, in these moments, supplied what the body lacked. There is something quietly remarkable in this, the capacity of thought to generate not actual warmth, but the sensation of it. In a war so defined by physical deprivation, the imagination became its own furnace. In all of these small, strange comforts, one sees the same pattern repeated. Warmth in the trenches was never abundant, never easy, and never clean. It came in odd forms: bricks, shell casings, newspapers, rats, cigarettes, songs, straw, and dreams. Each comfort was temporary, fragile, and often a little absurd, yet together they formed a patchwork of survival. They reveal not only how soldiers coped with cold, but how the human spirit adapts, inventing rituals out of desperation, finding solace in the most unlikely of places. The strange comforts of trench life remind us that warmth is not always about fire or heat. Sometimes it is about memory, ritual, imagination, or even the presence of creatures one would rather avoid. Sometimes it is about holding close whatever burns, glows, or breathes, no matter how fleeting or fragile it may be. In the end, these comforts were not grand solutions, nor were they reliable. The bricks cooled, the straw rotted, the newspapers tore, the cigarettes burned to ash. But for a moment, an hour, a night, perhaps just the span of a single song, they allowed men to believe in warmth. And belief itself, fragile though it may seem, was a comfort worth holding on to in the long winters of the Great War. The earth became more than just a battlefield in the First World War. It was carved open, reshaped, and transformed into a second world below the surface, a dim, damp labyrinth that soldiers would come to know as intimately as their own homes, if home is the right word. These underground spaces, dugouts, were both a refuge from the elements and a prison of sorts. They were cramped, dark, and always damp, but compared to the exposure of the trenches above, they offered something close to safety, and at times a strange kind of comfort. The very act of descending into a dugout was a ritual of changing worlds. Soldiers might leave behind a frostbitten trench where icy winds swept through the parapets, and step into a shadowy underground chamber, where the air was still, though heavy with the smell of damp wood, earth, and the faint lingering smoke of candles or stoves. The silence, too, was different. Above ground, even in moments without artillery fire, there was always a restless hum, distant guns, the whistle of wind across open ground, the drip of water, the mutter of men shifting their boots in mud. Underground, those noises softened, muffled by soil and timber, replaced instead by the creaks of beams, the occasional scurry of a rat, and the subdued murmur of soldiers speaking in low tones, their voices naturally hushed as though the earth itself demanded quiet. Dugouts were not uniform. Some were little more than shallow holes scraped into a trench wall, just deep enough for a man to crouch or perhaps lie down, with little protection but a few planks of wood above. Others, especially on sections of the front where armies had time to dig deeper and fortify, could descend several meters below the surface. These more elaborate dugouts were reinforced with timber, lined with planks, and fitted with bunks, tables, and even makeshift stoves. In certain stretches of the Western Front, particularly the German lines, there were dugouts large enough to serve as underground barracks, command posts, or medical stations. Some were linked by narrow tunnels, creating a whole subterranean network beneath the battlefield. And yet, for all the effort put into them, the dugouts remained uncomfortable places to live. They were damp, often flooded, and always cold in winter. Soldiers sometimes woke to find their blankets stiff with frost, or the wooden beams above dripping steadily with condensation. But here, in the dim glow of candles or the faint orange of an oil lamp, men found something precious, distance from the biting wind, from the constant spray of mud, and from the relentless exposure of life in the open trench. It was, for some, the only place where sleep felt possible at all. The strangeness of underground life lay partly in its unnatural rhythm. Men became accustomed to measuring their days not by sunlight but by the weak flicker of a candle stub. Time seemed to stretch and blur underground. A few hours of rest could feel like an entire day, while at other moments a night could slip by unnoticed, swallowed in the thick darkness. The dugout, in this way, created a different sense of existence, one cut off from the ordinary cues of life above ground. There were strange comforts too. In the depths of a dugout, men sometimes discovered a kind of intimacy with their comrades that trench life rarely allowed. Sitting close together in the glow of a single lamp, men might share stories, exchange cigarettes, or simply sit in silence, the warmth of presence more powerful than words. The underground chambers became a place where the war's harsh edges seemed momentarily softened, where soldiers could pretend, just for an hour or two, that they were somewhere else, perhaps in a cellar back home, waiting out a storm, rather than crouching beneath a battlefield that roared overhead. But there were also uncanny moments, the sort of small, unsettling details that stuck in men's minds. Rats were constant companions, bold and fearless in the darkness, sometimes gnawing on boots, or even nibbling at sleeping soldiers' ears and fingers. Men told stories of rats so large they resembled cats, their bellies swollen from feeding on the plentiful dead. The walls of dugouts sometimes shifted or creaked ominously after heavy shelling, reminding those inside that a few more direct hits might bring the entire weight of the earth down upon them. And there was the odd sensation, reported by many, of hearing the muffled rumble of voices, laughter, or footsteps from other dugouts nearby, as if the ground itself was carrying ghostly echoes of unseen lives. One peculiar detail emerges from soldiers' letters: the underground smell. Dugouts carried a particular scent that many could not forget, a mixture of damp soil, stale smoke, sweat, wet wool, and paraffin. It clung to everything, from uniforms to blankets, and after a while, men reported they could recognize someone who had spent time in a dugout simply by the earthy scent that lingered on them. It was not a pleasant smell, but in its own way, it became familiar, a sensory marker of shelter, however imperfect. The deeper dugouts, especially those built by the Germans, sometimes reached such sophistication that they bewildered the men who entered them. Stories circulated of dugouts with multiple rooms, fitted with doors, stoves, and even furniture carried down from ruined villages. One British soldier described stumbling into a German dugout that resembled a rustic tavern, with benches, tables, and shelves stocked with bottles. It was as though, beneath the surface of a blasted, barren battlefield, another world had been secretly built, a hidden village under the mud. For men accustomed to sleeping half upright in narrow, waterlogged spaces, these glimpses of subterranean comfort felt almost unreal, and perhaps a little disorienting. There were superstitions too, for any place that existed in such strange conditions invited them. Some soldiers whispered that dugouts were haunted by the spirits of men buried alive, and they described hearing faint knocks or scratching noises from the beams in the night. Rational explanations, wood expanding with damp, the movements of rats were possible, but in the darkness, with exhaustion clouding the mind, such sounds could feel uncanny. Men sometimes spoke of uneasy dreams in dugouts, vivid and lingering, dreams of being buried under soil, or of wandering through endless underground passages that never led back to the surface. The dugout, in its way, was both sanctuary and trap. Men longed for the relief it offered, but knew too well the dangers it carried. A direct shell strike could collapse a dugout entirely, entombing those inside. The Germans called such strikes Minen, and the British referred to them grimly as earthquakes. Survivors of such collapses sometimes emerged dazed and half suffocated, their hair and skin caked with soil, their voices hoarse from shouting in the dark. For those who perished underground, there was often no recovery. The earth simply absorbed them. Yet, despite all this, the dugouts remained indispensable. Soldiers carved bits of personality into them. They might pin up a photograph from home or carve initials into a wooden beam. Some drew crude sketches on the walls with bits of charcoal, a fleeting attempt at decoration. Others named their dugouts, scrawling signs above the entrances, names like the Ritz, Buckingham Palace, or Hotel Mud, wry jokes that masked the reality inside. Perhaps the strangest thought is this: in those underground chambers, men lived a life that was neither fully war nor fully peace. It was suspended, in between, a twilight existence beneath the mud. They could hear the rumble of war above, sometimes faint, sometimes terrifyingly close. Yet down below they passed hours in the company of candlelight, stories, the scratching of rats, and the persistent smell of earth. In the memory of many who returned home, these dugouts lingered not only as places of discomfort and danger, but also as peculiar havens, spaces where the unbearable life of the trenches became just slightly more bearable. And if one imagines those moments carefully, one might almost hear it: the slow creak of a wooden beam, the soft murmur of tired voices, the faint flicker of a candle flame trembling in the still air. Men huddled close on wooden bunks, their boots drying slowly by a guttering stove, while rats scurried unseen in the corners. The world above was frozen, blasted, and merciless. But down here, underground, in the dim and strange half-light of the dugout, soldiers found, if not warmth, then at least a fragile shelter. It was an odd kind of life, one that existed in shadows, and one that perhaps can only be truly understood by imagining the earth itself as both a shield and a silent companion. The nights of winter in the trenches stretched on endlessly, as if time itself slowed down beneath the pale glow of a moon that never seemed to move across the sky. Darkness in wartime was never quite the same as darkness in peace. Here, in the frozen quiet of the front, night was thick, heavy, and sometimes almost suffocating, settling over the landscape like a weight that pressed against the skin. Soldiers often remarked that the winter nights felt longer than any day they had known at home, as if the hours multiplied themselves, stretching into something that tested the mind as much as the body. Above ground, the world was reduced to silence, punctuated by small, sharp sounds, the occasional crack of rifle fire from some distant sentry, the groan of wooden planks as they shifted under frost, or the faint hiss of frozen mud as it tightened in the cold. Everything else was still, so still that men could hear their own breathing, and even the slow beat of their hearts beneath layers of heavy wool. The air was crisp, almost brittle, and each exhalation lingered as a faint cloud, drifting away, before dissolving into the endless dark. The trench at night was a narrow corridor of shadow. Small lanterns or dim candles flickered here and there, their light carefully shielded to avoid attracting attention. Beyond their glow stretched a kind of nothingness, a void of mud walls and frost-covered parapets that seemed to continue endlessly in both directions. For a soldier standing watch, the silence could play tricks on the senses. Shapes appeared in the distance, only to dissolve into shadows again. The sound of ice cracking underfoot could resemble the click of a rifle bolt. Men learned to doubt their own eyes and ears, for the night magnified everything, giving ordinary noises the weight of ominous signs. But it was not only fear or duty that made the night so long. It was also the sheer monotony. A soldier might sit in the cold for hours, his body wrapped in greatcoats, his hands buried in gloves stiff with frost, waiting for time to pass. He would stamp his feet, rub his arms, and shift his weight from side to side, but nothing seemed to make the minutes move faster. One described it as living inside a clock whose hands refused to turn. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and restless, easily disturbed by the smallest sound or the chill that crept inevitably into every fold of clothing. What is strange, and perhaps a little unsettling, is how quickly the men adapted to these nights. After weeks of service in winter, soldiers began to measure time not in hours or minutes, but in sensations. The moment the frost first settled on their coats, the dull ache of numb toes, the welcome warmth of rum rations sipped slowly from a tin cup, the relief when another man came to relieve them from sentry duty. Time became a sequence of bodily states rather than a steady progression. Some men later wrote that their sense of night and day dissolved entirely, as though they had entered another rhythm of life, one governed by cold darkness and the fragile routines of trench existence. There was also a peculiar soundscape to the winter nights. Beyond the occasional noises of war, there were natural sounds that seemed amplified in the stillness. The hoot of an owl could carry far across the frosty air, sounding louder than gunfire. A rat scuttling through a dugout could echo like footsteps. Even the steady drip of water from a melting icicle might seem strangely resonant, marking time with an uneven rhythm that played itself out in the darkness. Soldiers sometimes spoke of lying awake, counting these drips as though they were the beats of a strange subterranean clock. The strangeness extended further, into the realm of dreams. Many men recorded that their sleep in the trenches, when it came at all, was filled with unusually vivid and disorienting dreams. Some dreamed of being at home, seated by firesides or in familiar kitchens, only to awaken suddenly to the chill of mud walls pressing close around them. Others dreamed of warmth itself, glowing stoves, steaming bowls of soup, or even abstract visions of light and heat. There were also darker dreams, uncanny and persistent, of being buried in snow, of endless wandering through corridors of frost, or of voices whispering in the night, voices they did not recognize. In these moments, the boundary between waking and dreaming seemed thinner than in ordinary life, as if the long nights blurred the edges of reality itself. Letters from the front describe another curious detail: the habit of talking to the night. Soldiers alone on sentry duty often found themselves whispering quietly, sometimes prayers, sometimes fragments of songs, sometimes just words spoken aloud to break the silence. One man wrote that he spoke to the moon as if it were a companion, telling it stories about his home. Another described murmuring to the frost itself, as if it were a living thing that surrounded him. These small acts may seem unusual, but they reveal something about the way soldiers sought comfort in the endless nights, by creating voices where none existed, by animating the stillness with words. There was, too, the ever-present relationship with the stars. In places where the night sky was visible, men often found themselves gazing upward, their eyes tracing constellations they had learned as children. The stars shone with a clarity rarely seen in cities, sharp and cold above the battlefield. Some soldiers confessed that looking at the stars gave them an eerie sense of distance, as though they had left the world entirely and entered another realm, timeless and infinite. For men huddled in mud, staring up at Orion or the Pleiades may have been one of the few connections to a larger, unchanging order, something untouched by war. And yet, it could also be unsettling, a reminder of how small and fragile their lives were against the cold enormity of the sky. Inside the dugouts, the nights passed differently. Men lay close together on wooden bunks, wrapped in blankets, their breaths mingling in the still, musty air. Here, the darkness was almost absolute, relieved only by the faint glow of a candle stub or the dim embers of a stove. The nights underground were filled with the sound of breathing, coughing, and the occasional murmur of dreams. There was comfort in that nearness, but also a peculiar intimacy, an awareness of every shift of the body, every sigh, every whisper. In such close quarters, even silence felt communal, as though the men were sharing the same unspoken thought, and so the long winter nights carried their own kind of weight. They were a test of endurance, but also a strange education in slowness. Soldiers learned to wait, to inhabit hours that seemed to go nowhere, to find meaning in the smallest details, the sound of dripping water, the shape of a shadow, the distant cry of an owl. They learned to live inside the cold, to breathe with it, to speak to it, even to dream in its presence. Perhaps the strangest thing is how many men later remembered the nights not only as a hardship, but also as a kind of stillness that lingered in their memories. For all the misery of frozen boots and sleepless hours, the winter nights of the trenches carried a certain quiet that was unlike anything else in their lives. The war was chaos, destruction, and noise. But here, under the cover of frost and darkness, time slowed. And in that slowing, in that frozen suspension, there was something unforgettable. One might imagine it now. The faint outline of a trench stretching away into darkness, the soft crunch of frost beneath a soldier's boot, the pale breath rising in the air, the distant gleam of stars in a sky that seems endless. Somewhere, a candle flickers faintly in a dugout. Somewhere else, a man whispers a few words to the night, as though it were listening, and the hours pass endlessly, until morning comes not with warmth, but with the dim grey light of another frozen day. The war was always measured in battles and victories, in offensives and retreats, but for the men in the trenches, it was also measured in smaller things. A candle stub that lasted a little longer than expected, a pair of socks that managed to stay dry for one more day, the shared warmth of men huddled together against a frost that never seemed to loosen its grip. Survival in the frozen trenches of the First World War was less about grand strategies and more about these small, fragile triumphs. And yet, even within this bleak and narrow world, there were moments of quiet endurance that defied the misery of the cold. Men found warmth in places that were not always physical. A few lines from a letter, read over and over again, could create a feeling of heat within the chest that was stronger than any fire. A whispered joke between two tired soldiers could briefly thaw the air of a dugout, turning the night into something almost bearable. A memory of home, a kitchen stove, a wool blanket, the smell of bread just out of the oven could be called up in the mind again and again, as though memory itself carried an ember. What is curious is how these small comforts, intangible as they were, sometimes lasted longer in the mind than the cold itself. Men wrote later that they forgot the particular chill of a night, but remembered the way a friend shared a cigarette, or the way a small group of soldiers passed a single piece of chocolate from hand to hand. The body forgot the frost, but the heart remembered the warmth of companionship. Even the strange, unpleasant details sometimes carried their own odd intimacy. The sight of boots lined in newspaper, or men wrapping themselves in sandbags, might appear pitiable in hindsight, but at the time, these little inventions became symbols of resilience. They were reminders that the human spirit finds ways to continue, even when the body falters. There is something quietly fascinating in the thought that a man might spend a winter's night with newspapers crackling beneath his uniform, or that another might sleep with a rat pressed against his leg for warmth. It was uncomfortable, certainly, but also a strange kind of companionship in the bleakest of nights. The dugouts themselves, damp and crowded as they were, became places of endurance that went beyond the physical. In the low light of a single candle, men told each other stories of places far removed from mud and frost. Someone spoke of the warmth of an Italian summer, another described the still heat of a harvest field at home, and for a brief while, the frost retreated before these imagined climates. The strangeness lies in the fact that the mind could summon warmth more effectively than any fire the men managed to light. It was as though imagination itself became a hearth in the darkness. There is also something to be said about silence. Modern life rarely allows for the kind of stillness those men experienced on winter nights in the trenches. Between the occasional rifle crack or distant rumble of artillery, there was a silence so deep it seemed to press upon the ears. Some soldiers wrote later that they could hear the earth itself, settling, shifting, groaning softly under the weight of frost. In such silence, even a whispered word became powerful, carrying meaning far beyond its sound. Perhaps this is why so many soldiers whispered to the night, as if the darkness itself were listening. When morning finally arrived after one of those endless nights, it rarely brought the warmth that men longed for. The sun in winter was pale, thin, and distant, casting little heat onto the frost-stiff ground. And yet, there was still relief in the light itself, a sense that the hours had moved forward after all. The night had not lasted forever. Time, though slow, had not stopped entirely. Men rose, stamped their feet, and began again the small daily battle to keep warm, to endure, to wait for the day to pass until night returned once more. And so, in the end, warmth in the frozen trenches was never just about fire, or clothing, or rum. It was about endurance, about small acts of sharing, about finding embers in the most unlikely places. Warmth came from within as much as without, from memory, from imagination, from the companionship of men who understood each other's suffering in a way no one else could. The winters of the First World War are long gone, their cold preserved only in faded letters, in the quiet lines of diaries, in the photographs of men wrapped in heavy coats. The frost has melted, the trenches have softened into the earth, and the silence has been replaced by the ordinary sounds of fields and birds. But perhaps it is worth remembering, gently, that those who endured did so not through heroism or grand victories, but through small, quiet acts of survival. A candle, a blanket, a whispered word in the night. And now, as we let the story fade into stillness, you may imagine yourself no longer in the frozen trenches, but wrapped in the comfort of your own blanket, safe and warm, far from the frost. The night outside your window is not endless. Morning will come, as it always has, and with it a softer light than those men once knew. Until then, you may rest, breathe slowly, and let the silence settle around you like a cloak. Good night.